The Gallery in the Forest, an Appalachian nightmare horror novella by Rick Spruce, read by me. Part 1. The Hollow Path. The silence was the point, or at least, that was how Jenna had sold it to Liam. Not the dead silence of a soundproofed room in the city, but a living silence, one woven from the rusted of unseen things in the undergrowth, the distant caw of a crow, and the whisper of wind through the high canopy of the oaks and hickories. It was a silence that was supposed to scour them clean, to strip away the noise of the last 6 months and leave them with whatever was left of their foundation. Jenna checked the topographic map again, her thumb tracing the faint brown contour lines that indicated the steepness of the climb ahead. Her pack, perfectly balanced and cinched tight, felt like a part of her. Liam's, by contrast, seemed to be an alien appendage he was still learning to coexist with. It listed slightly to one side, and a loose strap tapped against his water bottle with a hollow rhythm that was beginning to grate on Jenna's nerves. "You see that light?" Liam said, stopping to unshoulder his camera. He was always seeing the light. He saw it in the grimy reflection of a puddle on asphalt, in the flicker of a dying fluorescent tube in their apartment building's hallway, and now here, in the way a single beam of morning sun speared through the dense foliage to illuminate a patch of moss on a fallen log. "We need to keep moving, Liam. The trail guide said this ridge is a 3-hour climb. That's for experienced hikers." He didn't answer, already bringing the camera to his eye, his body contorting to get the perfect angle. He was an artist, a photographer who captured textures and forgotten corners. It was one of the first things she had loved about him, his ability to find beauty where she only saw decay or inefficiency. Now, it felt like a liability, another distraction from the practical matter of forward momentum. Their life had become a series of his beautiful distractions and her practical momentums, pulling in opposite directions until the strain was a constant humming tension between them. This hike was supposed to fix that, a challenge, an unmarked trail deep in the Appalachian range that required focus and teamwork. They were going to conquer something together, to remind themselves that they could. But an hour in, they had fallen into their old city roles. Liam was the observer, capturing moments, while Jenna was the project manager, worried about timelines and objectives. "Got it," he said, a triumphant smile on his face as he lowered the camera. He jogged to catch up with her, showing her the image on the small screen. It was a stunning photograph. The moss was a universe of green, vibrant, and alive, kissed by that single divine ray of light. It was beautiful. It was also 5 minutes they didn't have. "It's great," she said, the words feeling thin and obligatory. She turned and started walking again, the pace just a little faster than before. She heard his sigh behind her, a small puff of disappointment into the crisp October air. They walked on, the silence returning, but it was a different kind now. It was heavier, filled with the things they would not say. She wanted to talk about the lease renewal, about the credit card bill she had found hidden in his desk drawer, about the fact that he had not sold a single print in 4 months. He wanted to talk about the suffocating weight of the city, about the art he felt he was meant to create if only they could escape, if only she could understand. The woods were supposed to be neutral ground, but they had brought their battlefields with them, packed away with the trail mix and the first aid kit. The path steepened, and the climb became a purely physical effort. Their breaths came in ragged plumes, and the burn in their thighs silenced the arguments in their heads. The forest was ancient here, the trees thick-trunked and patient, their bark like the wrinkled skin of elephants. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, leaving the world in a perpetual state of deep green twilight. They were alone, utterly and completely. No other hikers, no distant sound of traffic, no contrails scarring the perfect pale blue sky. "This is it," Liam said, breathing heavily as they reached a small, flat clearing. "This is what I was talking about. You can't find this feeling anywhere in the city. It's real." Jenna took a long pull from her water bottle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to admit, he was right. The air was clean and sharp, scented with damp earth and decaying leaves. It felt primal, fundamental. A part of her that had been clenched tight for months began to slowly unclench. Maybe this could work. Maybe the woods could heal them. "We should talk," Liam said, his voice soft. Jenna's stomach tightened again. "About what?" "Us. The future. Everything." He gestured vaguely at the trees around them. I found a place. Online. A small cabin for rent in Vermont. It's cheap. We could afford it for a year, even with no sales. I could work. Really work. And you." "And me what, Liam?" "What would I do in a cabin in Vermont?" Her voice was sharper than she intended. "You'd be free," he said, his eyes pleading. "Free from that soul-crushing job, from the noise, from all of it. We could reset. Remember why we got together in the first place." The argument was a familiar one, a well-worn path they had trod many times before. To him, it was an escape, a romantic adventure. To her, it was a retreat, an abdication of responsibility. His dream of a cabin in the woods felt like a cage to her, a place where her own ambitions would go to wither and die while he chased his artistic muse. "That's not freedom. It's fantasy," she said, her voice low and tight. "We have responsibilities, a life. You can't just run away to the woods when things get hard. Is that what you think this is, running away?" His face clouded over, the earlier joy gone, replaced by a familiar, wounded look. "I'm trying to save us, Jenna. Don't you see that? We are drowning. I can feel it every single day. I'm not drowning. I'm building a life. The life we agreed we wanted. I never agreed to this," he shot back, his voice rising. "This wasn't the plan." "I never agreed to feel like a failure every day. Because my art doesn't pay the rent on an apartment we can't afford in a city that doesn't care if we live or die." The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. They had breached the fragile truce. They were no longer in the woods. They were back in their cramped apartment, the same circular argument playing out under a canopy of ancient trees. Anger, hot and blinding, flared in Jenna's chest. She turned her back on him and stormed ahead, wanting only to put distance between them, to walk fast enough to outpace the hurt. She was so focused on the furious pounding of her own heart that she didn't see the faint, moss-covered blaze on the tree to her right. She did not register the almost imperceptible fork in the trail. She just kept walking, her boots crunching on dry leaves and twigs, her gaze fixed on nothing. Liam followed a few paces behind, his silence a heavy, brooding weight. They walked for another 10 minutes before the anger began to cool, leaving a familiar residue of exhaustion and regret. It was Liam who spoke first, his voice devoid of its earlier passion. "Jenna, wait." She stopped, but she did not turn around. "The path," he said. "It's different." She finally looked. He was right. The trail, which had been a clear, well-trodden route, had narrowed considerably. It was now little more than a deer track, flanked by dense thickets of mountain laurel that clawed at their clothes. The canopy above seemed to have sealed itself shut, plunging the path into a deeper, more profound gloom. An unnatural chill had settled in the air. Jenna pulled out the map and her compass. The map was useless. This narrow, winding, hollow path was not on it. She held the compass flat in her palm, waiting for the red needle to settle on north. It quivered, swung wildly in a half-circle, then spun slowly, round and round, a captured thing in its clear plastic prison. "That's not right," she whispered. Liam came to stand beside her, peering at the compass. "Magnetic interference? Iron deposits in the rock?" "Maybe," Jenna said, though she did not believe it. She had been hiking since she was a girl. She had seen compasses deviate, but never like this. This felt wrong. Fundamentally wrong. "We should go back. Back to the fork." They turned, the argument forgotten, replaced by a shared, unspoken flicker of unease. But the path behind them was not the one they had just walked. It looked just as overgrown, just as unfamiliar as the path ahead. The sense of direction she always carried within her, her internal compass, was gone. It felt as if the forest had reshuffled itself the moment they were not looking. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the base of Jenna's skull. She looked up at the sky, trying to get a bearing from the sun. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The sun, which should have been high in the sky, was impossibly low, a pale, watery orb sinking toward the jagged line of the western ridge. The light was the color of old brass, the long, distorted shadows of the trees stretching across the forest floor like grasping fingers. It was the light of late evening, of early afternoon. "How is that possible?" Liam asked, his voice a strained whisper. "We've only been hiking for a few hours." Jenna had no answer. The world had tilted on its axis. Time, direction, the very rules of the wilderness she had always trusted, had become fluid and unreliable. They were lost. Not just lost on a trail, but lost in a way that felt deeper, more elemental. The living silence of the forest no longer felt cleansing. It felt predatory. They tried to backtrack, forcing their way through the tangled brush, but every direction looked the same. The oppressive sameness of the trees, the relentless green and brown, became a kind of prison. Every tree looked like the last one. Every rock, every patch of moss was a replica of one they had just passed. They were walking in circles, though Jenna's instinct screamed that they were moving in a straight line. It was then that the sounds began. At first, they were subtle enough to be dismissed. A bird call, the clear, cheerful song of a chickadee, suddenly dissolved midway through its melody into a scratchy hiss, like radio static. Jenna and Liam both stopped, looking up into the canopy. The sound was gone. "Did you hear that?" Liam asked. "Just a bird," Jenna said, forcing a confidence she did not feel. They walked on. A few minutes later, the frantic chattering of a squirrel erupted from a nearby branch, a familiar, scolding sound. But then it changed. The rhythm remained, but the sound itself warped, becoming the distinct mechanical clatter of typewriter keys striking paper. It lasted only a few seconds before fading back into the natural sounds of the woods. This time they did not speak of it. They just exchanged a wide-eyed glance and walked a little faster, a little closer together. The forest was playing tricks on them, a symphony of the impossible. A fox elped somewhere off to their right, a sharp, piercing cry. As they listened, the cry held its note, then softened, sweetened, and transformed into the tinny, melancholic chime of a music box play a half-remembered lullaby. The delicate notes hung in the cold air for a moment, achingly sad and deeply out of place, before vanishing completely. "Okay," Liam said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am definitely not imagining that." Jenna's pragmatic mind scrambled for an explanation. A hermit with a radio? Another hiker with a sick sense of humor? But the sounds were too seamless, the transitions too perfect. They felt like they were coming from the woods itself, as if the forest were a vast organic recording device playing back corrupted files of a world that did not belong here. The fear was no longer a flicker. It was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. They pressed on, driven by a desperate need to find something that made sense, a landmark, a trailblaze, anything familiar. And then they started finding the breadcrumbs. It was Liam who saw the first one. He stopped, his gaze fixed to a thick branch of an oak tree about 10 feet off the ground. "What is that?" Jenna followed his gaze. Perched perfectly upright, as if placed there for display, was a single child's sneaker. It was a red canvas high top, its white laces still tied in a neat bow. The rubber toe was scuffed, the color slightly faded by the sun, but it was not rotted or covered in moss. It looked as if it had been placed there that morning. A lost object, perhaps, but its placement was too deliberate, too strange. There was no way a child could have reached that high, no way it could have fallen and landed so perfectly. 100 yards later, they found the next item. Resting on a large, moss-covered boulder was a pair of vintage eyeglasses. They were the wire-rimmed, horn-shelled type her grandfather used to wear. The lenses were thick and perfectly intact, impossibly clean in the damp, decaying environment of the forest floor. They sat there as if their owner had just set them down to rest his eyes and would be back at any moment to retrieve them. Jenna reached out a hesitant hand, but stopped short of touching them. They felt private, like an artifact in a tomb. The unease was solidifying into a specific kind of dread. This was not random. It was a collection. A curated gallery of the lost. The feeling was confirmed when they found the lunchbox. It was tucked into the hollow of a lightning-scarred poplar tree. A child's metal lunchbox from the 1950s, its painted surface showing faded images of cowboys lassoing cartoon aliens in a desert landscape. It was dented and scratched, but the latch was still functional. With a shared look of trepidation, Liam reached in and carefully lifted it out. He shook it gently. Something rattled inside. A single, small object. His hands were unsteady as he worked the rusty latch open. The lid creaked, revealing the clean, silvered interior. It was empty, except for one thing lying in the center, a single, small vertebra from a deer, picked clean and polished to a smooth ivory sheen. Liam dropped the lunchbox with a clatter. The small bone rolled out onto the leaves. He stared at it, his face pale. The juxtaposition was grotesque. The innocent nostalgia of the lunchbox, the clinical, finished quality of the bone inside. It is a message, a statement of intent, but the meaning was terrifyingly obscure. It spoke of a process, of something being taken, stripped down, and preserved. The sun had finally bled away behind the mountains, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The temperature plummeted, and the woods were swallowed by a profound darkness that seemed to suck the very warmth from their bodies. They had to stop. To continue blindly was suicide. They found a small defensible clearing, a shallow depression in the earth with a large boulder at their backs. Their gear was for a day hike, no tent, no sleeping bags. They had only their emergency mylar blankets, a handful of protein bars, and a small fire-starting kit. The argument that had started their disastrous detour felt like it had happened to two different people in another lifetime. The petty grievances of their city life had been burned away by a primal, overriding fear. Liam, his hands shaking, struggled to get a fire going. Jenna gathered dried twigs and leaves, her movements quick and efficient, her mind focused on the immediate task: survival. That was all that mattered now. The fire finally caught, a small, courageous flower of light in the vast, oppressive darkness. It pushed the shadows back a few feet, creating a fragile bubble of warmth and visibility, but it also made the surrounding darkness seem deeper, more absolute. The woods became a solid wall of black, alive with unseen, listening things. They huddled together, sharing the thin, crinkling space of a single emergency blanket, their shoulders pressed tight. They ate a protein bar in silence, the dry, chalky texture coating their tongues. They did not speak of the sounds or the objects. To give voice to them would be to make them more real, and they were already too real. "We'll find the trail in the morning," Jenna said, her voice a hoarse whisper. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Morning felt a world away. "We should try to sleep," Liam said, though his eyes were wide, constantly scanning the impenetrable perimeter of their firelight. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on them. Liam eventually drifted off, his head slumping against his pack, his breathing becoming deep and even. Jenna fought to stay awake, her role as the protector, the pragmatic one, kicking into overdrive. She stared into the fire, watching the embers pulse like a beating heart. The silence of the woods had returned, but it was a waiting silence now, heavy and expectant. The crickets were silent. The owls were not hooting. The forest was holding its breath. She listened to the crack of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind through the pines. For a moment, a strange sense of peace settled over her. They were alive. They were together. They would figure this out. That is when she heard it. It was a whisper, as clear and distinct as if someone were standing right beside us, their lips brushing against the ear. "Jenna." It was Liam's voice, unmistakably his, the exact inflection, the gentle cadence he used only with her. Her head snapped around, her heart leaping into her throat, but Liam was still fast asleep, his face relaxed in the flickering firelight, his lips still. He had not moved, he had not made a sound. The whisper had not come from him. It had come from the absolute, crushing darkness just beyond the fire, from the deep and hollow woods that had been watching them all along. Part 2. The Borrowed Voice. Jenna did not move. She remained a statue of coiled tension, her own breathing a deafening roar in her ears. The fire crackled, oblivious. Liam slept awe, a portrait of innocence in the flickering light. The voice had been a phantom, a trick of the wind or a waking dream born of terror and exhaustion. It had to be. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the sound from her memory, to file it away with the bird static and the music box fox as another symptom of this place's sickness. But it had been too clear, too perfect. It was the sound of her name on Liam's lips in their quietest moments, a sound that belonged to darkened bedrooms and lazy Sunday mornings, not to this oppressive, malevolent wilderness. She slowly, deliberately, opened her eyes and scanned the wall of blackness that encircled their tiny island of light. The darkness stared back, impassive and absolute. There was nothing there. And that, somehow, was the most terrifying thing of all. Sleep was no longer an option. She sat awake for the rest of the night, feeding the fire stick by stick, her senses stretched to a painful, vibrant tautness. Every snap of a twig, every rust of the leaves was a potential approach. She was a sentry guarding a fortress of sand against a tide she could not see. When the first hint of gray dawn finally began to dilute the ink-black sky, it was not a relief, but a different kind of dread. The night had been about hiding from the unknown. The day would be about confronting it. She gently shook Liam awake. He stirred with a groan, his face pale and etched with exhaustion. "Did you sleep?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Enough," she lied. "We need to pack up. Get moving while we have the light." He nodded, pushing himself into a sitting position. His gaze fell upon the spot where he had left his canteen the night before, next to his pack. He frowned. "Where's my water?" Jenna's blood ran cold. She looked at the spot. Her canteen was there, but his, the larger of the two, was gone. They scanned the small clearing, their eyes darting into the undergrowth at the edge of the firelight. It was nowhere. "Maybe a raccoon dragged it off," Liam suggested, his voice lacking conviction. "It was full, Liam. It was heavy, and the cap was screwed on tight." Jenna knelt, her fingers tracing the packed earth where the canteen had been. Something was there, something small and white, nestled in the dirt. At first, she thought it was a pebble. She picked it up. It was smooth, hard, and curved, with a distinct root at one end. A sick, metallic taste filled her mouth as the recognition dawned. She was holding a human tooth. A molar, its surface worn, a dark spot of decay in one side. She did not scream. The horror was too deep, too cold for that. She simply opened her hand and showed it to Liam. He stared at it, his face a mask of confusion that slowly curdled into dawning terror. He scrambled back, away from the object, as if its very presence were a contagion. "What is that?" he whispered, though he already knew. "It was a trade," Jenna said, her voice a flat, dead thin. "A tooth for the canteen. A piece for a part." The logic was insane, but it was the only thing that made sense. Something had come into their camp while they slept. "I startet som var igen at give a fint ansikte på tingene. They talked about it was going to take for again. They did this at the throat of that. We should talk for it in a long time. And he didn't. And the guy got this rot. You don't think it's so basic. Her stench from a potato. It had stood close enough to make the exchange, to take the canteen and leave its grotesque little payment. It had watched them, perhaps for hours. They left the tooth where it lay. To take it with them felt like accepting the terms of the bargain, like participating in the creature's twisted economy. They packed their meager supplies in a frantic, clumsy silence, the single remaining canteen a precious, mocking totem between them. The woods watched, no longer passive. It was an active participant now, an entity with a will and a horrifying, incomprehensible purpose. They chose a direction at random and began to walk, their thirst a nagging reminder of their vulnerability. A strange sound started again, but they were different now, more personal, more cruel. Jenna was the first to hear it. A low, clear whistle, a simple two-note call that her father used to use to summon it from the woods behind their house when she was a child. Her father had been dead for 10 years, her head whipped around, her eyes scanning the trees. There was nothing, just the endless green and brown. "What is it?" Liam asked, seeing the look at her face. "Nothing," she said, her throat tight. She would not give it the satisfaction of a reaction. She would not let it know it had found a nerve. But the sound came again, closer this time, a perfect, heartbreaking imitation of a ghost. She stumbled, a wave of grief and terror washing over her. An hour later, it was Liam's turn. A soft humming drifted through the trees, a wordless, gentle tune. Liam stopped dead in his tracks, his face ash. "My mom," he breathed. "That's the song she used to hum when I was sick." The humming continued, weaving through the trees, a sound of comfort and love twisted into a weapon of psychological torment. It was a violation, a defilement of something sacred and private. The creature was not just mimicking sounds from the woods, it was reaching into their heads, pulling out their most tender memories, and throwing them back in their faces. Then it began to use their own words. Jenna heard her own voice, laced with contempt, whispered just behind Liam's ear, "It's not freedom, it's fantasy." Liam flinched as if struck. He spun around to face her, his eyes hurt and accusatory. "Why would you say that?" "I didn't say anything," Jenna insisted, her heart pounding. "I heard you. You whispered it, right behind me." Before he could respond, Liam heard his own voice, dripping with angry resentment, mutter near her, "I never agreed to this." Jenna stopped, the words a physical blow. "What did you just say?" "Nothing. I didn't say anything," he insisted, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. They stood 20 feet apart, staring at each other with a new, corrosive suspicion. The creature had found their fracture line, the raw, open wound of their argument. and it was pouring salt into it. It was trying to isolate them, to turn them against each other, to break the only bond that might give them the strength to survive. "It's not us," Jenna said, forcing herself to walk toward him, to close the distance the voice had created. "It's the woods. It's this place. It's stealing our voices, our memories. Don't you see? It's trying to break us apart." Liam looked at her, his eyes wide with fear, but a flicker of doubt remained. The whispers had sounded too real, too perfectly timed to their own internal anxieties. The seed of paranoia had been planted. They walked off, the silence between them now strained and suspicious. Every few minutes a new whisper would coil out of the woods, a twisted echo of their fight. Her accusation, his defense, her practicality, his dreams. All of it was harvested and replayed in a cruel, endless loop until the memory of the actual argument became hopelessly blurred with the ghostly imitations. It was mid-afternoon when they stumbled into a small, ruined clearing. The remains of a rotted canvas tent clung to a collapsed frame. A rusted camp stove lay on its side, half swallowed by moss. This was a place where someone else had been lost a long time ago. A cold comfort to know they were not the first. Near the remains of an old fire pit, Liam found it. A leather-bound journal, its cover swollen and dark with years of rain and damp. Most of the pages were a solid block of molded paper, but a few in the center had been partially protected. The ink was faded, the handwriting a spidery, desperate scrawl, but some of it was still legible. They huddled together, carefully turning the fragile pages. October 12, 1978. 6th day lost. Compass is a liar. Sun is a liar. Robert is losing hope. He keeps hearing his wife calling for him. "I hear nothing but the wind, but it sounds like it's laughing. The woods are playing with us. It feels like we're being digested." October 10th, it took Robert's harmonica last night, left a bird's skull in its place. He saw it, said it was tall and made of sticks and mud like a child's bad dream. He said it had no face, just a collection of things. I think he's gone mad. October 15th, it has a name for itself now in my head. The Collector. It doesn't want to kill us, the all at once. It wants pieces. It steals sounds first, then memories. Robert asked me this morning who I was. He didn't recognize me. He stared at me with empty eyes. The Collector is erasing him, taking the parts that made him Robert and leaving the rest. October 10th, he's gone like... Robert walked into the woods this morning, humming a song I've never heard. He didn't take his pack, just walked away. I didn't try to stop him. The Collector has him now. Am I next? It has started using my father's voice. It knows about the farm. It knows about the fire. The last entry was a single, shaky sentence. It doesn't just take. It borrows. Jenna closed the journal, her hands trembling. Sound thief. A memory collector. The words gave a name to their terror, a shape to the formless dread that had been stalking them. This thing did not just hunt, it curated, it erased people piece by piece. The vertebra in the lunchbox, the tooth, the stolen canteen, the borrowed voices, it was all part of a single horrifying process. Liam, the artist, seemed to be taking it the hardest. His sensitivity, once a source of strength, was now a dangerous vulnerability. He started seeing things, fleeting impossibilities at the edge of his vision. "Did you see that?" he'd ask, pointing at a thicket of ferns. "See what?" A flash of red, like a raincoat, a child's raincoat. But when Jenna looked, there was nothing but the deep uniform green. Later was a patch of brilliant synthetic blue against the trunk of a pine tree. Like a modern tent, he whispered, but it would vanish the moment he tried to focus on it. They were memory images, fragments of other stories, other victims, bleeding through into his perception. The collector's gallery was beginning to overflow. They were following a shallow, sluggish stream, hoping it might lead them to a larger body of water, to some sign of civilization, when they finally saw it. The stream opened into a wide, muddy ravine. On the other side, partially obscured by a curtain of hanging moss, something moved. It was not an animal. It was tall and possibly thin, and it moved with a silent, unnatural fluidity, like a strand of kelp drifting in a slow current. Its body was a grotesque assemblage of woven roots, dark river clay, and decaying leaves. It had long, spindly limbs that ended in sharp, twig-like fingers, but it was the things embedded in its form that made Jenna's breath stop in her chest. A shard of a porcelain doll's face, the rusted metal buckle of a belt, a single mud-caked hiking boot, and there, stuck in the center of its chest like a grotesque locket, was their stolen cantee. The late afternoon sun glinted off the metal, a bright, accusatory flash. It had no face, no eyes, just the collage of stolen lives, this museum of the lost. Then it simply dissolved. It didn't run or retreat. It flowed backward into the deep shadows of the forest, its form breaking apart and merging with the trees and undergrowth until it was gone, leaving only the image of their canteen seared into their minds. They stood frozen. The image of the creature burned into their minds. The physical proof, the confirmation of the journal's ravings, was 100 times worse than the uncertainty had been. They were being hunted by a living junk pile of human sorrow. After that, the attacks became more intimate. The collector was no longer content to simply replay their argument. It began to excavate their deepest insecurities, the fears they barely admitted to themselves, and it used the other's voice to deliver the blow. Jenna, terrified of her own growing desire for a safe, predictable life, heard Liam's voice whisper with mocking pity, "You're just afraid. You're settling because you're too scared to want more." Liam, whose artistic ambition was a constant battle with his fear of failure, heard Jenna's voice, cold and clinical, say, "You'll never be good enough. You're just a man playing with a camera." They denied it to each other, but the damage was done. The whispers were too specific, too perfectly aimed. How could this thing know their most private shames? Was it reading their minds, or were they projecting their own fears onto the sounds, their paranoia giving the mimicry its sharp, poisoned edge? It didn't matter. The effect was the same. They began to look at each other not as partners, but as the source of their deepest anxieties. Liam began to unravel more quickly. The sensory bleed, the flashes of color and memory intensified. He would stop walking and stare at his own hands, a look of profound confusion on his face.
"Do you remember the rain in Boston?"
He asked her once, his eyes distant.
"We've never been to Boston together,"
she said carefully. "Yes, we have," he insisted, a strange frustration in his voice. "The cobblestones were slick. We ducked into that little bookshop to stay dry. It smelled like old paper and vanilla. You bought that collection of poetry." He was describing a memory, a vivid and complete one, but it was not theirs. He was accessing the collection, pulling a file that belonged to someone else, some other hiker who had loved poetry and rainy days in Boston. He was becoming a receiver for the static of dead men's lives. Jenna's fear for him was a sharp, physical ache. She saw him slipping away, his own identity being diluted by the ghosts of the forest. The collector was not just stalking them, it was actively unmaking Liam before her very eyes. Late in the day, as the light began to fail again, they heard a new sound. It was different from the whispers, different from the mimicked bird calls and hum. It was the sound of a child, crying. It was not a ghostly, ethereal sound. It was wrenchingly real, a series of desperate, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from a small hollow just ahead of them. "A kid?" Liam said, his head snapping up, the fog of confusion in his eyes momentarily clearing. "Someone's out here with a kid?" Jenna's every instinct screamed at her. It was a trap. After everything they had experienced, the impossible sounds, the journal, the sight of the creature itself, this could only be a lure. It was too perfect, too calculated to prey on their last vestiges of humanity. "Liam, no," she said, grabbing his arm. "Don't. It's not real. It sounds real," he insisted, his face filled with a desperate hope. "What if they're hurt? We can't just leave them." The crying continued, punctuated by a terrified plea. "Mommy, I'm scared." The voice of a little girl no older than 6 or 7. It was a sound designed to bypass all rational thought, to strike directly at the heart. Liam's empathy, the part of him that found beauty in forgotten things, was now a fatal flaw. He pulled his arm free from Jenna's grasp. "I have to check, I have to," he said, and started moving toward the sound. Jenna had a choice. Let him go alone or follow him into the obvious trap. It was no choice at all. Cursing her own compassion, she followed him, her hand gripping the small, useless knife from her multi-tool. The sobs led them over a small rise and down into a shallow, bowl-shaped clearing. It was a perfectly circular space, carpeted with an unnaturally vibrant green moss. The trees that ringed the clearing were huge and ancient, their branches interlocking overhead to form a kind of natural, living dome. The air here was still and cold, and the moment they stepped into the clearing, the sound of the crying child stopped. It was replaced by an immediate, profound silence, a silence so deep it felt like a pressure against their eardrums. Then a single sound broke the stillness, the clear, cheerful song of a chickadee. It was joined a second later by the hiss of static, then the chattering of a squirrel that morphed into the clatter of typewriter keys. The fox's cry melted into the chime of a music box. Her father's whistle, his mother's lullaby, the whispers from their argument, from their deepest fears, the crying child, the poetry lover from Boston, Robert's lost harmonica. Dozens, then hundreds of sounds, all stolen, all corrupted, began to play at once. They came from all directions, a cacophony of disjointed memories and stolen lives. The air vibrated with the impossible noise. It was a sensory assault, a symphony of the damned. They were standing in the heart of the collector's library, and every single book was screaming at them at once. Liam sank to his knees, his hands clamped over his ears, his face a mask of agony. Jenna remained standing, paralyzed, as the tidal wave of sound washed over her, threatening to tear his sanity apart, piece by stolen piece. Part 3. The Assemblage. The sound did not fade. It ceased. It was as if a switch had been thrown, plunging the world from a hurricane of noise into a vacuum of absolute silence. The sudden absence was a physical blow, leaving a high, thin ringing in Jenna's ears. The air in the clearing felt dead and heavy, stripped of all vibration. Liam was still on his knees, his hands locked over his ears, his body trembling violently. His eyes were screwed shut, his face a mess of terror and pain. "Liam," Jenna said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud and thin in the dead air. It was like speaking in a padded room. He did not respond. She knelt beside him, prying his cold, rigid fingers from the sides of his head. "Liam, it's over." It stopped. He opened his eyes, but they were not focused on her. They were wide and glass, staring at some internal horror she could not see. He was still trapped in the echo of the sonic assault. The collector had overloaded his senses, short-circuiting the fragile wiring of his mind. Panic, sharp and fierce, lanced through Jenna. She could not lose him. "Out here, out like this." She gripped his shoulders and shook him, harder than she meant to. "Liam, look at he. Look at he." His gaze slowly, sluggishly, drifted to a face. Recognition flickered deep within his eyes, a tiny pilot light in a vast darkness. "The sounds," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "So many. They were all inside my head." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "But they're gone now. We're okay." It was a lie. They were far from okay. As her own senses began to recover from the onslaught, she became aware of their surroundings. This was not just a clearing. The unnatural silence, the perfect circle of trees, the vibrant moss under their feet. It was a space with a purpose. And as her eyes adjusted to the deep gloom under the canopy, she began to see what that purpose was. They were standing in a gallery. All around the perimeter of the clearing, arranged with the chilling, deliberate artistry, were the sculptures. They were not carved from stone or molded from clay in any traditional sense. They were assembled from the lost. To her left, a great tangled monument rose from the moss. It was a latticework of deer antlers and whitened branches, but woven through it, like grotesque ribbons, were strips of human clothing. A faded flannel shirt, a child's denim overall, a woman's floral scarf. Tied into the weave, with strands of what could only be human hair, were smaller objects. A silver Zippo lighter, a pair of car keys, a plastic barrette in the shape of a butterfly. It was a monument to vanished autumn hikes and family camping trips gone wrong. Jenna felt a wave of nausea. She forced herself to look away, only to have her gaze land on the next piece. A rusted bicycle frame, the kind a paperboy might have used decades ago, was fused to the complete articulated skeleton of a white-tailed deer. The deer's forelegs were threaded through the spokes of the front wheel, and its skull rested on the handlebars, its empty socket staring forward down a path it would never take. The whole thing was draped in a fine mesh of fishing line, from which dozens of spectacles were suspended, turning slowly in a non-existent breeze, their lenses flashing dully in the dim light, like the compound eyes of some monstrous insect. "My God," Liam breathed, his own horror pulling him back to the present. He was seeing it now, too. He pointed a trembling finger toward the base of a massive oak tree. There, arranged in a neat, semicircular display, was a collection of boots. Hiking boots, work boots, even a single elegant woman's riding boot. They were filled not with dirt or leaves, but with curated collections of small personal effects. One was overflowing with buttons of every shape and size. Another was filled with spent rifle casings. The riding boot held a cascade of tarnished silver coins and a handful of wedding rings. Each one was a story, a life, truncated and repurposed into this macabre display. This was the collector's lair. This was its art, a museum of violent interruption. The journal had been right. It did not just take, it preserved, it curated. It found the most distinct parts of a person, of a life boot that walked 1,000 miles, the keys that started the final journey, the glasses that saw a final, terrifying sight, and it made them into art. It was the work of a being with a psychology so alien, so far removed from human comprehension, that it defied all categories of good and evil. It was the aesthetic of a predator. Liam staggered to his feet, drawn toward one of the sculptures as if in a trance. Jenna followed, her hand hovering near his back, afraid to touch him, afraid of what he might do. He stopped in front of a tall, thin assemblage made from the stripped and dried husks of mountain laurel bushes. Stretched across this pale skeletal frame, like a grotesque canvas, was a large sheet of synthetic blue fabric, a section of a modern tent wall. Liam had seen it. The flash of blue at the edge of his vision had been real. It was a memory fragment from this very place. Tied to one of the branches with the leather bootlace was a small, laminated trail map, its edges chewed and faded. And next to it, pinned to the blue fabric with a sharpened stick, was a scrap of a t-shirt. It was made of a technical, sweat-wicking material, and it bore a distinctive geometric pattern in orange and gray. Liam stared at the scrap of fabric, his face draining of all color. "I know that shirt," he whispered. He backed away from the sculpture, his eyes wide with a new, more specific horror. "Missing hiker. The one on the poster at the trailhead. His name was Ben Crawford. He was wearing that shirt in the photograph. The abstract horror had just become terrifyingly concrete. Ben Crawford was not just missing. He was here. Or at least, the parts of him that the collector had deemed worthy of its collection were here. The tent he slept in, the map that failed him, the shirt he wore on his final day. They were all now exhibits in this silent, screaming gallery." A sound broke the stillness, a soft, wet, dragging noise. It came from the far side of the clearing, from the deep shadows between two of the largest trees. Jenna spun around, pulling Liam back with her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "The collector was here. It had finished its overture of sound and had come to admire its work and its new audience." Emerged from the darkness, not with a sudden lunge, but with a slow, deliberate grace. It flowed into the clearing, its tall, spindly form seeming to pour from the shadows. Seeing it up close was 100 times worse than the brief glimpse across the ravine. It was a masterpiece of natural decay and human detritus, a walking, breathing sculpture in the same vein as the art that surrounded them. Its body was a tightly woven core of roots and river clay, giving it a solid earth presence. But its skin, its outer layer, was a constantly shifting collage of leaves, moss, and strips of bark. Its long, jointless limbs ended in fingers of sharpened wood and what looked like shards of animal bone. Embedded in its form were its most recent acquisitions. The glint of their cantee was still there in its chest, and woven into its shoulder was a small, bright red object. The child's sneaker they had seen on the branch. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth. Its head was a lumpy, asymmetrical mass of hardened mud and woven grass. But as it turned toward them, Jenna felt an undeniable sense of being watched, of being appraised. This was not the mindless, frenzied attack of a bear or a mountain lion. This was the cool, calculating gaze of an artist inspecting a new piece of raw material. It moved toward them with a silent, gliding motion, its twig-like feet barely disturbing the moss. Its posture was not one of aggression, but of intense, unnerving curiosity. It was, Jenna realized with a surge of cold dread, trying to decide which parts of them were worth keeping. Liam was frozen, paralyzed by the creature's presence. But Jenna's fear was being burned away by a hot, defiant surge of adrenaline. Her pragmatic mind, the part of her that managed projects and met deadlines, took over. The objective was simple: survive. The obstacle was a 7-foot-tall monster made of sticks and nightmares. The collector was 10 feet away when it raised one of its long arms. Its fingers, a bundle of sharp sticks and bone, unfurled slowly. It was not reaching for them in a swipe or a grab. It was an inquisitive gesture, as if it wanted to touch them, to feel their texture, to see what they were made of. That gentle, curious motion was the most terrifying thing of all. "Run!" Jenna breathed, shoving Liam toward the edge of the clearing. The shove broke his paralysis. He stumbled, then scrambled, his feet finding purchase on the slick moss, but he was too slow. The creature, with a movement that was impossibly fast for its size, glided forward. Its long arm shot out, not at Jenna, but at Liam. It was not trying to kill him, it was trying to stop him. The sharpened twig fingers raked across Liam's forearm as he tried to pull away. The sound was like a branch being dragged across rough canvas. Liam cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise. He staggered back, clutching his arm, his face white. The collector stopped. It did not press the attack. Instead, its head tilted, a gesture of intense focus. It seemed to be listening, not with ears, but with its entire body, to the sound of Liam's cry. It was savoring it, cataloging it. Then its attention shifted to the wound it had created. 3 long, parallel gashes ran from Liam's wrist to his elbow. They were not deep, but they were bleeding freely, the dark red blood welling up and dripping onto the vibrant green moss. The creature seemed fascinated by the color, by the contrast, by the life spilling out of him. It had found a new pigment for its palate. Seeing Liam hurt, seeing his blood of the ground, shattered the last of Jenna's fear and replaced it with a cold, protective rage. While the creature was distracted by its new discovery, she acted. Her eyes darted around the clearing, searching for a weapon. Her gaze fell upon one of the sculptures, the one made of boots. Near its base was a heavy, fist-sized rock, smooth and gray, that was being used to prop up one of the work boots. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around its solid, reassuring weight. She did not give herself fight to think, to hesitate. She spun, took 2 running steps, and threw all of her weight into a single, desperate act of defiance. She slammed the rock into the side of the collector's torso. The impact didn't make the wet, fleshy sound she expected. It made a dry, brittle, cracking noise, like a clay pot shattering. The creature staggered back a step, a web of fine cracks appearing on its mud and root surface. A fine, dry dust, like powdered clay, sifted out from the point of impact. It let out a sound, its first and only sound. It was not a roar of pain or a hiss of anger. It was a chorus of all its stolen noises at once, a single discordant blast of static and whispers and music that erupted from its entire body. In its surprise, its hand, the one that had been reaching for Liam, opened. Something small and metallic fell from its grasp, landing softly on the moss. The creature did not look at the object it had dropped. It looked at Jenna. The feeling of being appraised was gone. Now she felt a new, focused intensity, a cold and analytical anger. She had damaged the collection. She had damaged the collector. "Jenna, go!" Liam yelled, his voice shaking. She did not need to be told twice. She grabbed his uninjured arm and pulled, dragging him with her as she sprinted for the edge of the clearing. They ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, the terrible, cacophonous sound of the creature's rage chasing them. They did not dare look back. They just ran, fueled by terror and adrenaline, expecting at any moment to feel its sharp fingers close around their necks. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. The discordant noise of the creature faded behind them, replaced once again by the deep, unsettling silence of the woods. They finally collapsed at the base of a huge sycamore tree, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and reaction. Liam was pale, cradling his injured arm. Jenna's hands were scraped and bleeding from her mad dash through the brush. For a long time they just sat there, gasping for air. The image of the gallery burned into their minds. "Did you see it?" Liam finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It was. A museum. A museum of everyone who ever got lost here." "I saw it," Jenna said, her voice grim. "We're not going to be a part of it." She took their first aid kit from her pack. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the zipper. She cleaned Liam's wound as best she could with her dwindling supply of antiseptic wipes and wrapped it tightly with gauze. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the cuts were jagged and ugly. As she was packing the kit away, her eyes fell on the object that had been lying on the ground near Liam's pack. It must have fallen from her pocket during their frantic escape. It was the small, tarnished, silver object the creature had dropped. A harmonica. Robert's harmonica, from the journal. The one it had traded for a bird's skull. She picked it up. It was cold and heavy in her hand, a relic from a ghost. She held it out to Liam. The creature dropped this. He took it from her, his fingers closing around the metal. He stared at it, his expression distant and strange. "Roberts," he said. It was not a question. They sat in silence for a while longer as the adrenaline drained away. leaving them cold and exposed. The woods, which had seemed merely wrong before, now felt actively, personally hostile. They had seen the architect of their misery. They had trespassed in its sacred space, and they had fought back. It would not forget that. Jenna was about to suggest they move again when Liam spoke, his voice quiet and confused. "Jenna," he said. "Look." He held out his injured arm. She had just bandaged it, but he had pushed the gauze aside. She leaned closer, expecting to see that the bleeding had started again, but it was not the blood that he was showing her. It was the skin around the wound. The flesh along the edges of the 3 long gashes was changing. It was losing its soft, pinkish tone and turning a pale ashish gray. The texture was changing too. It was becoming rough, patterned with fine, vertical lines. It looked, impossibly, like the bark of a birch tree. Jenna stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. "It's just a reaction," she said, her voice thin and unconvincing. The branch was dirty. An infection. "It doesn't feel like an infection," Liam said, his voice filled with a quiet, terrified wonder. "It doesn't hurt. It just feels cold and hard." He touched the graying skin with the fingers of his good hand. It was true. The skin was unnaturally fur, rigid to the touch. The transformation was slow, but undeniable. The collector had left its mark on him. It had wounded him, and now the wound was remaking him in the image of the forest it commanded. A piece of him was being claimed, rewritten. They were both still staring at his arm when a new sound cut through the silence. It was not a borrowed voice or a mimicked animal cry. It was music, a simple, haunting melody, played on a harmonica. It was a lonely, mournful tune filled with a deep and ancient sadness. Jenna looked up, her blood running cold. The sound was coming from right beside her. Liam was holding the silver harmonica to his lips. His eyes were half closed, his expression vacant. He was playing the sad, simple song with a familiarity that spoke of long practice. But Liam did not know how to play the harmonica. He had never picked one up in his entire life. He was playing Robert's song, the song of a man who had been erased. The melody he was humming as he walked into the woods to be collected. Part 4. The Unmaking. The last note of the harmonica hung in the cold, still air, a perfect, lonely quaver that seemed to drain the world of all other sound. It was a note of profound finality, the musical equivalent of a closing door. Then, silence. Jenna snatched the harmonica from Liam's lips. The metal was cold against his fingers. He blinked, his eyes losing their vacant, far-off glaze and refocusing on her face. A look of deep confusion washed over him. He looked from her angry, terrified expression to the silver instrument in her hand as if seeing it for the first time. "What?" he asked, his voice his own again, laced with bewilderment. "Where did that come from?" "You were playing it," Jenna said, her voice a harsh whisper. She shoved the harmonica deep into her pocket, wanting to put its cursed weight out of sight. "You were playing a song." "No, I wasn't," he said, shaking his head. The denial was genuine, his confusion absolute. "I don't know how to play. I was just sitting here." "My arm hurts." He looked down at the bandaged wound, his brows furrowed in a moment of pure, unadulterated self-pity, the expression of a man with a normal injury, not one whose very flesh was undergoing an alchemical transformation. He had no memory of the music, no awareness of the alien melody that had just poured from him. He was a passenger in his own body, and something else was occasionally taking the wheel. A ghost named Robert, or something far older that had consumed Robert, was using Liam as its instrument. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon. They could not stay where they were. They had to move, to find a place to endure another night. Every instinct screamed at Jenna to leave the harmonica behind, to throw it as deep into the woods as she could. But the pragmatic part of her, the part that still clung to the rules of a world that no longer existed, refused. It was an object, a piece of metal. It could not be haunted. It was the place that was haunted, and they could not throw the place away. They walked, Liam leaning on her, his energy depleted. The transformation of his arm seemed to be draining the life from the rest of him. They found a shallow overhang of rock, not quite a cave, but enough to offer a sense of shelter, a barrier on one side against the encroaching darkness. Jenna set about building a fire, her movements economical and practiced. She had become brutally efficient in the art of survival. Liam sat watching her, his injured arm held protectively against his chest, his expression lost and distant. The fire caught, and once again they were in their tiny bubble of light, a fragile raft on a black, silent ocean. For the first hour, there was nothing. No sounds, no whispers. The silence was almost worse. It was an attentive silence, a predator's patience. Jenna knew it was out there. It was watching. She had damaged it, and it would not forget. And then she saw it. It was standing at the very edge of the firelight's reach, just where the light frayed into impenetrable shadow. It was a silhouette, tall and impossibly thin, its form a jagged disruption of the familiar tree trunks. It was not moving. It was simply that. Watch. Jenna's hand went to the heavy rock she had kept from the clearing, her knuckles white. She did not speak, did not alert Liam. To acknowledge the watcher would be to give it power, to invite it closer. She stared back at it, her gaze a defiant challenge across the flickering expanse of light. Its shape was different. There was a new texture on its shoulder, a small dark patch that caught the light with a faint sheen. A piece of Liam's technical shirt, torn during his fall. It had already added the scrap to its form. It was cataloging them, piece by piece, even as they still lived. It was not just a stalker, it was an archivist. Liam stirred beside her. My arm feels tight, he complained, his voice small. The bandage is too tight. Let me see, she said, her eyes never leaving the silent figure in the darkness. She could not let it see her fear. She had to pretend this was normal, a simple camping trip with an unusual spectator. She helped Liam unwind the gauze. What lay beneath made her stomach clench. The transformation had accelerated. The gray, bark-like skin now covered the entire wound, and it was spreading. Tendril of discoloration reaching down toward his wrist and toward his elbow. It was no longer just the texture of bark, it was becoming bark. She could see the rough, layered texture of it, the deep fissures and lines like a miniature landscape of ancient wood grafted onto his flesh. I can't feel it, he whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and terror. He poked at the gray flesh with his other hand. It's numb, like it's not part of me anymore. The infection, as she had tried to call it, was not just on him. It was replace him. He was a canvas, and the forest was slowly, methodically painting over him with itself. Jenna redressed the wound, her movements gentle but firm. Try to rest, she said. He lay down, his head on his pack, but his eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the fire. Is it out there? He asked, his voice trembling. Jenna didn't have to ask what it was. I'm here, she said. The words a promise she was not sure she could keep. It won't get past me. She stayed awake, her back to the rock, the heavy stone in her lap. The figure never moved. It was a statue of patient malice, a sentinel of their slow decay. At some point, Liam's breathing deepened into sleep. Hours passed. The moon, a sliver of bone, clad the sky. The figure remained. Jenna's world shrank to the circle of firelight, the sleeping form of her partner, and the silent, watching monster. Sometime before dawn, Liam began to murmur in his sleep. Not words, at first, just soft, troubled sounds. Then he spoke, his voice clear in the quiet night. Mary, he said. Tell Mary I'm sorry. About the window. Jenna's blood froze. Who was Mary? He said the name with a familiar, weary affection. He was dreaming someone else's dream, apologizing for someone else's sin. The boundaries of his mind were dissolving. She did not sleep. When the gray light of morning finally returned, the figure was gone. It had vanished as silently as it had appeared. Liam awoke slowly, a deep, groaning exhaustion clinging to him. He sat up and looked around the small campsite, a frown on his face. Where are we? He asked. The woods, Jenna said carefully, watching his face. We're still in the woods. No, I mean, which part? He looked at the trees, the rocks, as if expecting to recognize them. This doesn't look like the path to the falls. He was talking about a trail they had hiked 2 years ago, 100 miles from here. His sense of two in place was becoming unmoored. Jenna knew then that she was in a new kind of race. It was not just about finding a way out of the woods, it was about keeping Liam inside his own head long enough to make the journey. She had to fight the erasure. Liam, she said, her voice sharp and clear. What's our address? He looked at her, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. What kind of question is that? Just answer, Roo. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He stared at the fire pit, his brow furrowed in concentration. It's on Oak Street, number 142. He had grown up in a house on Oak Street. They lived in a city apartment on Crawford Avenue. Jenna's heart sank. No, she said. That's not it. Yes, it is, he insisted, his voice rising in frustration. He was not just wrong, he was certain. The false memory was as solid to him as the rock behind him. She had to pull him back. She had to anchor him. Think, Liam. Think about our first apartment together. The one in the city. Remember the landlord, Mr. Henderson, with the little dog that always barked at you? She tried to paint a picture, to fill it with sensory details, anything to activate his own memories, to push out the invading ones. Remember the sound the radiator made in winter, like a dying whale, and the way the afternoon light came through the fire escape and made patterns on the floor? He took a picture of it. It was the first one you sold. She was trying to rebuild his past for him, brick by brick. For a moment, it seemed to work. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. The light, he said softly. Yes, I remember the light. But then his expression clouded over. But it wasn't on the floor. It was on the water, down at the docks. That's where I took the picture. He was mixing and matching, taking pieces of their shared history and splicing them with the memories of strangers. He was a collage, just like the creature that hunted them. Jenna's desperate gambit had failed. In fact, it had made things worse. By asking him to focus on a strong, emotionally charged memory, she had seemingly made it a more valuable target for the collector. It was as if she had held out a shining jewel in the darkness, and the thief had simply plucked it from her hands. The best memories, the most vibrant and defining ones, were the most delicious, the most worthy of being collected. To save him, she had to let him forget. It was a devastating, impossible conclusion. They packed it and walked on, Jenna leading, Liam stumbling behind it. He was quieter now, lost in the fog of his disintegrating mind. The transformation in his arm was no longer creeping, it was marching. The bark now extended from the tips of his fingers, which were becoming hard and stiff, to his shoulder. He could no longer bend his elbow. His left arm had become a single, rigid wooden limb. He carried it awkwardly at his side, a foreign object he was forced to endure. By midday, he was speaking in fragments, his sentences a patchwork of different lives. "The tide's coming in," he'd murmur, staring at a sea of ferns. "We need to get the nets." A moment later, he'd look at the sky and say, "She loved the blue ones, with the little white flowers. I should have brought us some." Jenna stopped trying to correct him. She just answered in soothing, non-committal tones, treating him like a feverish child. Her partner, the man who saw beauty in decaying brickwork and captured light in a box, was being unmade before her eyes. The parts that made him Liam, his memories, his perspective, his love, were being stripped away, leaving only a confused, hollow shell. Late in the afternoon, during a moment when they had stopped to rest, he suddenly became still. The confused, foggy look left his eyes. He turned his head and looked directly at Jenna, and for the first time in what felt like days, she saw him. Her Liam. He was there, looking out from the prison of his crumbling mind. "Jenna," he said, his voice calm and clear, imbued with a terrible preternatural wisdom. "It's not evil." She stared at him, caught off guard by his sudden lucidity. "What are you talking about?" "The collector," he said, the name coming easily to his lips. "It doesn't think it's hurting us. It thinks it's an honor." He spoke with a strange, detached authority, as if he were translating a difficult text. "Things get lost out here. People, they die, they rot, they vanish, they're forgotten. All their stories, all their loves, all their fears, it just turns to dust. It thinks that's a tragedy, a waste." "Liam, what are you saying? You're not making sense. It's a curator, Jenna. The most important moments, the defining objects, the strongest feelings. It saves them. It takes them so they won't be lost forever. It builds monuments to them so they won't be forgotten." His gaze drifted to the gallery they had escaped. "It thinks it's giving them immortality. It's a form of reverence." He looked at his own bark-covered arm, a strange acceptance on his face. "It doesn't just take things, it trades. A piece for a passage. It wants a toll. The most valuable part of you. The thing that makes you you. You give it that, and it lets the rest of you go." Jenna stared at him, a cold dread coiling in her gut. He was not just speculating. He was explaining. He was somehow connected to the creature's consciousness, a receiver for its alien philosophy. He was being unmade, and in the process he was gaining a terrifying understanding of the artist that was unmaking him. "That's insane," she said, her voice shaking. "You're being manipulated. It's getting inside your head. It's already inside my head," he said with a sad, simple finality. "It's been inside all of them. Robert, the boy with the bicycle, the hiker with the orange and gray shirt. They all learn the rules eventually." His moment of clarity passed. The light in his eyes dimmed and the fog rolled back in. He looked at her, his expression becoming confused again. "Is it time for dinner yet?" he asked, his voice that of a small child. Jenna's pragmatic resolve hardened into a diamond-like core of fury. She would not accept this. She would not play by the monster's rules. There would be no trade. There would be no sacrifice. She would get them both out, whole and alive. She would drag him, kicking and screaming, back to a world of reason and sanity. It was a project, and she would not fail. That night they made their camp in a small clearing, the fire a weak beacon against the encroaching dark. Liam was almost completely gone now, humming Robert's sad, meandering tune on the harmonica which he had somehow retrieved from her pocket. The sound was a constant, mournful backdrop to Jenna's grim vigil. The collector appeared at its usual time, a silent, tall shape at the edge of the light. But tonight it was different. It was not just watching. It seemed restless, its form subtly shifting in the shadows. After an hour of silent observation, it took a single gliding step forward, bringing it just inside the clear ring of firelight. Jenna was on her feet in an instant, the heavy rock in her hand. "Get back!" she snarled, her voice a low growl. The creature stopped. Its head tilted, its attention was not on Liam, who was lost in his borrowed music. His focus was entirely on her defiance, on her rage, on her unbroken will to survive. Jenna understood. In her, it saw a prize. His memories were a scattered, fading collection. His will was broken, but she was still whole. Her defining trait, her fierce, stubborn, relentless drive to live, was burning like a star. It was the most valuable thing in this clearing, the most perfect piece for its collection. It took another slow, deliberate step forward. Liam stopped playing the harmonica. The abrupt silence was deafening. He looked up, his eyes clearing for a second time. But this was not the calm, philosophical lucidity from before. This was a flash of pure, terrified awareness. He saw the creature. He saw its focus on Jenna. He saw her terrified, defiant stance. In that one, final, fleeting moment of clarity, he understood everything. "No," he whispered. He looked down at his left arm. It was a dead thing, a useless wooden club, a part of the forest attached to his shoulder. He looked at Jenna, and his eyes filled with a desperate, heartbreaking love. He knew the rules. A piece for a passage, a toll. He had to make a better offer. With the speed and strength she did not know he still possessed, he acted. He grabbed his transformed left forearm with his right hand. He braced his feet on the ground, and he pulled. The sound was not human. It was the sharp, violent crack of a dead branch being snapped in two, a sound of unnatural fracture. It was followed by a scream, a pure, agonized sound that was all his, torn from the depths of his soul. Jenna watched in frozen, silent horror. He had broken his own arm. He held up the lower half, the section from the elbow to the hand, a solid, bark-covered piece of himself. It was not bleeding. Where the break had occurred, the inside was not flesh and bone, but a dry, fibrous, woody material, like the heart of a tree. He screamed again, a raw, continuous sound of agony, and with the last of his strength, he threw the severed part of himself onto the ground between them and the collector. It landed on the leaves with a dull wooden thud, an offering, a sacrifice. The collector stopped its advance. It stood perfectly still, its attention shifting from Jenna to the object on the ground. It glided forward, its twig-like fingers reaching down. It picked up the piece of Liam's arm. It brought it close to its faceless head, inspecting it with the intense, silent scrutiny of a connoisseur. It had been offered a gift. A piece, given willingly, a powerful, emotional, and utterly unique artifact for its collection. It seemed satisfied. It turned, the piece of Liam held carefully in its hand, and without a backward glance, it dissolved into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been in. The clearing was silent, save for Liam's ragged, gasping breaths. He had collapsed onto his side, his body convulsing. Jenna rushed to him, her mind a screaming void of shock and horror. She looked at his arm. The break was clean, a jagged, splintered surface of pale wood just below his elbow, and above the break, the creeping, gray bark had stopped. There was a clear, perfect line where the living flesh of his shoulder met the dead wooden stump of his upper arm. The bargain had been accepted. The toll had been paid. They had bought themselves died. But Jenna knew as she cradled Liam's shaking body that what she held was only a part of the man she had followed into these woods. The rest of him, the best of him, was being carried away into the darkness to be placed in a silent, screaming gallery of the lost. Part 5. The final part. Dawn arrived with warmth, but with a cold, clinical light that stripped the forest of its shadows and revealed the stark, brutal reality of their situation. The night's horrors could almost be dismissed as a nightmare, but the morning offered no such comfort. The evidence was irrefutable. It was there in the dark, drying stains of the leaf litter. It was there in the splintered, woody stump of Liam's left arm. And it was thas in his eyes. That was the worst part. His eyes. They were open, they were seeing, but they were not perceiving. They held the placid, uncurious gaze of an infant, taking in light and shape without context or meaning. The person behind them, the intricate network of memories, fears, and loves that constituted Liam, was gone. The fire had gone out, leaving only the empty vessel. He had passed out from the shock and agony shortly after the creature had left. Jenna had managed to clean the horrific wound as best she could, wrapping it tightly with the last of their gauze. There was no blood, only a slow, clear seepage of sap that smelled faintly of pine. She had held him through the last, long hours of the night, his body racked with tremors, his breathing shallow. Now, in the gray morning, he was awake, and he was hollow. "Liam?" she said, her voice a dry crackle. He turned his head toward the sound. There was no recognition in his face, no fear, no love, just a simple animal reflex. A sound had occurred, and he had oriented himself toward it. "We need to drink," she said, unscrewing the cap from their single canteen. She held it to his lips. He drank, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He did not seem to be thirsty, but he drank because water was being presented to him. When she pulled the canteen away, a dribble of water ran down his chin. He did not wipe it away. He simply sat that, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. Jenna's grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. This was not the man she had argued with at the fork in the trail. This was not the artist who saw light in forgotten corners. This was a biological machine, a collection of functioning organs in a shell that looked like a partner. The collector had not just taken his arm. It had taken his soul, traded for the worthless husk that remained. The bargain had not saved him. It had merely preserved his body. The silence in the camp was absolute. He no longer hummed Robert's song. He no longer spoke in the fragmented voices of the dead. The receiver had been disconnected from the broadcast. There was nothing left inside him for the forest to use. He was an empty house, its doors and windows thrown open to the wind. Jenna's pragmatism, the cold, hard engine that had driven her this far, took over. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. The objective remained the same: survive. The parameters had changed. She was no longer trying to save Liam. She was trying to evacuate his body. He was cargo now, precious and terribly fragile. She forced herself to eat the last of their protein bars, chewing the dry, tasteless paste with mechanical determination. She packed their few belongings, her movements efficient and precise. When it was time to go, she stood and gently pulled Liam to his feet. He came without resistance, his body pliant. "We have to walk now," she said, her voice the flat, encouraging tone one uses with a very small child or a very old man. He waltzed. "No, the muppet and the lions. Always for keeping monkey. Might be screwed. It's just, you'll be the best guy. We get the fuck out. We'll dollar in this. It's a gold. Why, see, if the net is someone won't over, I mean, hell, we'll move over. No, it's not about the hang out. It's Christoph. The idea to be good to the you if you got me, is me son. Oh, I'll take a stop there. Damn. His gait was unsteady, and he listed to his right, his body not yet accustomed to the new, lighter balance on his left side. Jenna walked beside him, her hand on his back, steadying him over rocks and roots. He was a dead weight, not of flesh, but of spirit. To look at his face was to look into a void. She knew their reprieve was a fiction. The collector was satisfied for now, but it was a connoisseur, and it had seen a masterpiece it wished to acquire. It had tasted her defiance, her will. It had seen the bright, furious fire of her survival instinct. It would not be content with a splinter of wood when it could have the flame itself. The forest was no safer now than it had been before. The silence was not peace. It was the pause between lightning and thunder. The predator was digesting its meal, waiting until it was hungry again. And she could not escape. Not with him. He was too slow, too unresponsive. She could not carry him, and she could not leave him. To abandon his body here would be a final, unthinkable desecration. He had sacrificed the last coherent piece of himself for her, and she owed him a debt that could not be paid in miles or hours. She owed him an exit from this place, even if he would never know it. They walked all day. Jenna navigated by instinct, by a desperate hope that if she kept the sun to her back, she would eventually walk out of this cursed patch of land. But the woods remained stubbornly, oppressively, the same. The same ancient trees, the same damp, mossy ground, the same deep, unnatural silence. There were no birds, no squirrels. The forest's lesser residents knew to stay away from the heart of the collection. Liam was a constant, draining presence at her side. He did not complain. He did not speak. He just walked, his empty eyes occasionally fixing on a leaf or a patch of sunlight, the same lack of interest. A few times he stumbled and she caught him, her own exhausted muscles screaming in protest. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological erosion was worse. With every passing hour, her hope, the fuel that had powered her rage and her will, was being ground down into a fine gray dust. She had fought, she had strategized, she had run, she had hidden, and all of it had been for nothing. The woods did not play by the rules of logic or endurance. It had its own rules, its own terrible, immutable economy of loss, a piece for a passage. The thought, once a terrifying revelation from Liam's fevered mind, now echoed in her own head with the cold, clear fin of truth. It was the only truth in this place. That evening, as the light began to fail, she stopped. They were in a small, unremarkable clearing. There was nothing to recommend it, nothing to defend it. It was just another spot in the endless, hostile woods. Jenna looked at Liam's vacant face, at the raw, splintered stump of his arm, at the vast, darkening forest that surrounded them. And she knew she could not endure another night of waiting for the silent figure to appear at the edge of the firelight. She could not spend another dawn waking up to a new, more profound level of despair. Her project plan had failed. All contingencies had been exhausted. The variables were all fixed against it. To continue on this path was not survival, it was simply a slower, more agonizing form of defeat. And so, with the last dregs of her pragmatic, problem-solving mind, she made a new plan. It was a monstrous, insane plan. It was a complete surrender, and it was the only logical thing to do. If you cannot win the game, you can at least choose how you lose. You cannot escape the toll, but you can choose what you pay. She turned Liam around, his body pivoting with a docile, unquestioning obedience. She faced him back in the direction from which they had come. "We're going back," she said. Her voice was steady, her tone resolved. She was no longer a victim fleeing a monster. She was a supplicant on her way to an altar. She was going back to the gallery. She was going to make a trade. The walk back was a surreal, funereal procession. Jenna, the condemned, leading Liam, the ghost, on a pilgrimage to her own unmaking. She did not need to navigate. The woods seemed to guide her now, the path becoming clearer, the way easier, as if the forest approved of her decision. It was welcoming her home. She thought about the choice she was about to make. A piece for a passage. The collector had wanted the strongest part of Liam, his memories, his love, his art. He had given it a piece of his body instead, a lesser but still acceptable payment. The creature had focused on her at the end. It had seen her essence, her relentless, stubborn, ferocious will to survive. It was the engine that had powered her through every horror. It was the core of her identity. It was the part of her that refused to break, the part that had thrown a rock at a nightmare, the part that was now, paradoxically, leading her to this final, terrible negotiation. That was what it would want. That was the only toll that would be high enough to purchase passage for two. They arrived at the edge of the gallery. As the last light of day was dying, the clearing was just as they had left it, a circle of profound silence and curated dread. The macabre sculptures stood like sentinels in the gloom, their collection of stolen lives glinting in the twilight. It was a place of endings, a library of final chapters. In the center of the clearing, the collector was waiting. It stood motionless, a tall, dark spire of earth and sorrow. It was not a surprise. She had known it would be here. It had known she would come. At its feet, placed neatly on the moss, was the severed, bark-covered piece of Liam's arm. It had been added to the display. Jenna stopped at the edge of the circle. She took a hand from Liam's back. "Wait here," she said softly. He stopped, his body immediately becoming still, a statue of waiting emptiness. Jenna took a deep breath. The air in the clearing was cold and still and tasted of damp earth and old regrets. She walked forward alone, her footsteps making no sound on the vibrant moss. She was not afraid. Fear was a component of the will to live, a warning system designed to preserve the self. She was here to decommission that system. She stopped 10 feet from the creature. She did not have a rock in her hand this time. She had no weapon, no defiance. She had only the offer. The collector did not move. It watched her, its faceless head tilted in that familiar inquisitive gesture. It was waiting for her to present her payment. How does one surrender a concept? How do you give away a part of your soul? Jenna closed her eyes. She reached inside herself, to the core of her being where the fire of her will had burned so brightly. It was a familiar feeling, that knot of fierce energy that had tightened in her stomach every time she had faced down the fear. It was the part of her that calculated, that strategized, that refused to give up. It was Jenna. She focused on that feeling. She held it in her mind, acknowledging it, thanking it for getting her this far. And then, with a conscious, deliberate act of internal will, she let it go. She didn't fight it. She didn't bargain. She simply opened her hand, metaphorically, and let the bright, burning thing fly free. The sensation was immediate and profound. It was a sudden, dizzying lightness, as if a great weight she had carried her entire life had been lifted from her shoulders. It was a feeling of profound peace, of utter and complete indifference. The cold knot of anxiety in her stomach dissolved into nothing. The constant humming tension behind her eyes went silent. The future, with its threats and possibilities, collapsed into a single, meaningless point. The present moment. She felt a wave of coldness wash through her, a pleasant numbing chill that extinguished the last embers of her fear, her hope, her love, her grief. They were all just aspects of the struggle, and the struggle was over. She opened her eyes. The world looked different. The colors were muted, the edges of things less defined. The macabre sculptures that ringed the clearing were no longer terrifying. They were just objects, arrangements of matter with no inherent meaning. The tall, spindly creature in front of her was no longer a monster. It was just a shape, a part of the landscape. It was all just landscape. The collector seemed to sense the transaction was complete. It bent, its twig-like fingers reaching not for her, but for a space in the air where her will had been. It seemed to gather something unseen, something ethereal, and then it straightened. It turned and glided to the base of the largest, most ancient oak tree. With a delicate, reverent motion, it placed its new acquisition, the pure, ferocious concept of a human's will to survive, into its collection. A space was made for it, an honored place among the lost and the broken. The gallery was complete. For now. Jenna turned and walked back to where Liam was waiting. He looked at her with the same empty eyes. She took his hand. His flesh was warm, but she felt nothing. She led him out of the clearing and began to walk. There was no direction, no purpose. Walking was simply what one did, one foot in front of the other. The forest was no longer hostile. It was no longer anything. It was just a place. A week later, a pair of deer hunters found them on an old, overgrown logging road 5 miles from the main trail. A man with a missing arm and a vacant stare, and a woman who walked beside him, holding his hand. She was physically unharmed, but she was completely unresponsive. She did not react to their calls, did not register their presence. Her eyes were calm and clear, but they were as empty as the man's. She moved when guided, ate when fed, and sat when placed in a chair. She was a placid, docile, and utterly hollow shell. She was safe. She had survived. But the part of her that would have cared, the part that would have felt the relief of rescue or the joy of seeing another human face, was gone. It had been left behind in a silent mossa clearing, deep in the Appalachian woods. It was the newest and perhaps the most prized piece in an ancient and secret collection.